Hi, everybody, and welcome to the ADHD Eavesdrop, where you can be a butterfly on the wall and listen in on my conversations.
Today's conversation with Dr. Melanie Sue Hicks is all about late ADHD diagnosis, doing too much, and the reality of trying to keep up with a brain that wants to do everything at once. We get into burnout, leadership, and what it takes to start working with your brain instead of against it.
Melanie, I'm so glad to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us about yourself.
So, I have a really ADHD style career, actually. I have a couple of different professional roles, including being an author and a speaker and running executive programs, as well as a workplace think tank where I study and speak about kind of workforce trends and organizational culture. And then I have a passion for writing and other authors. And so I founded a small independent publishing house that helps first time and emerging authors get their social impact work out into the world. So called Inked Elephant Publishing House. And so proud of all those endeavors, but they are as unique as any ADHD mind can make one.
Absolutely. It's like I do this and I do this and I do, and they're not always related, but sometimes mostly. And
Yeah, they're overlapping and they led to one another in a really natural way, but they look incongruent on paper.
now you are diagnosed with ADHD, a late diagnosed ADHDer. And you, like so many of us with ADHD, have this list that's so long of all the different things that we do and all the different things that we've accomplished. So tell me a little bit about the late diagnosis and how that all came about.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, I had been around a number of other women who talked about the idea that, we were all sort of fitting the mold of what was popping up. So a lot of, which I'm sure you've heard from other guests, a lot of times moms will take their kids in to be diagnosed. And in the process of having those conversations with doctors, they figure out sort of the genetic component of it, which is they've passed down to their kids. And as it relates to females, I'm a cusper right between Gen X and millennials, and we were just not diagnosed as females. So boys were diagnosed with ADD at that time, and girls, the symptoms that check the box were not how girls show ADHD and in those young ages. And so I was in gifted. I had all of the same kind of symptoms that are now, easily diagnosed, but we didn't do that for girls back then. And so I didn't know. But I started having conversations with moms that were like, Mel, I think this is us, basically, like, even though it wasn't me. And then I had a really, really great kind of a very good friend of mine who is a fellow writer, and we were on writing retreats together, and she had a full brain mapping done and a full neurological study and found out so much about herself and really inspired me to go and do some work on figuring out, what it looked like for me. And for me, the coping mechanisms were very intense. And I have a lot of activator. If you know Gallup Strength Finders, I have a lot of activator in my top 5 strengths. And so the way that it manifests for me is in, taking on a lot of different spinning plates and trying to kind of manage it. But that is a recipe for burnout, right? And so understanding that I have a tendency to want to carry more than I probably should, and kind of understanding how that manifests out in my leadership journey has been really illustrative to growing in a more strategic way around both my career and my personal life.
So when were you diagnosed? How old were you?
So 42. Yeah, 42, about 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, I was 50, so about 6 years ago. I taught special ed my whole life, though, and didn't manage to see it in myself.
Yeah, yeah, that works, right?
It's almost embarrassing to tell people, yeah, I found out when I was 50, but I've been working with those people all my life. Did you go in and get a diagnosis then? And what kind of made you decide you wanted to do that?
So I did what I would call a semi-diagnosis. So I went to my therapist and just said, like, how do I, what are some tools? What are some diagnostics? And so I didn't do as formalized as, for example, my friend who had a full brain analysis, but we some kind of online diagnostic tools and talked through the various things. And I read, I'm an incredible researcher and reader. And so I read book after book and academic article and medical journals and just sort of in a lot of ways self-educated myself around that reality and started to connect the dots into some of my own coping mechanisms that I had developed over the years and how those were either positively or negatively impacting me. Some of them are perfectly fine, and they're ways that I continue to sort of balance
You want
ADHD
to
and
share?
leadership and high functioning. What?
You want to share one? Some of your coping mechanisms?
I mean, one of the main things is time blocking for me. I have to time block. I set a ton of, I mean, I put everything on my calendar. I have both like an online Todoist app that I keep daily schedules of things that have to be done. I rank them by priority. I time block on my calendar to make sure. And I set a ton of alarms on my phone to move me from place to place. That was really, really important because time blindness and hyperfocus were absolutely two of the ways that it manifests for me and can be really detrimental to kind of just my professionalism in terms of showing up on time and being in the right headspace when I did show up. Because if I'm in, sort of deep focus and I have to get out of it and do something else and that can be really disruptive. And the other really important thing for me was figuring out how to kind of let myself off the hook a little bit in the sense of I would have a lot of self-imposed deadlines. And some of those were not necessary in the time factor that I needed. Like, not everything needed to be done, in a single day, or not everything needed to be done this week just because it got onto the to-do list. To really sit down and be more intentional about saying, okay, what are the real fires and emergencies, and what are the things that I can schedule out a little bit farther, and finding both the technology to keep up with those to-do lists, but also the kind of psychological willpower to say this, I don't have to, keep myself up at night if I don't finish all 20 things on the to-do list today. Like, I should better plan on having 3 main things I need to finish, maybe 10 other things that are quick that I need to get done, and then the rest I can sort of schedule out into the future.
And that leads to that whole thing with trying to prioritize because it's so hard for folks with ADHD to prioritize because everything seems important. So like when you said as soon as when it gets on the list, and
Mhm.
it's like because once it's on the list, it needs to get done, right?
That's right. That's right. Yes. And so that's why it's really helpful. Like, I am really addicted to this app called Todoist because it allows you to schedule out things that come back up weekly, then things that come back up monthly. It allows you to schedule things out into the future on a different day. It allows you to give one through 4 prioritization of each item, and that just really helps me stay organized. And that is the key to kind of relief of the constant kind of running cycle of thoughts that I'm having, or anxious thoughts about, needing to get more and more done and not being able to sort of relax or rest. And so that kind of organization is really important to me.
Yeah, and I know that you do a lot of work with people who, like you, tend to push themselves in. Like me, I was a central office administrator for a Class A school district for years, and just thought I could do it all and had all the lists and just overperformed. And everybody loved me for my masking and
Yeah.
all the things that that you talked about. Talk a little bit about, how we ADHDers can drive ourselves right into that exhaustion.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really easy to do for a number of reasons. So we tend to take on, there's a real tendency for shiny object syndrome, right? And especially for overachievers, there's a real sense of needing to do more. I can sit in a room and be like, I could do this better, or I don't need their help. I can do this, right? I can do this on my own. And there has to be a real sense of intentionality for delegation. There has to be a real sense of intentionality around saying, I don't have to do it all today. So I'll tell you, as a writer, I have an editor that I work with, thank goodness, who keeps me on track because I have 4 different creative projects in my brain at all times. And like, I can be working on 4 different books, but I can't finish anything if I don't finish one. Like, you have to finish one before you can start the next. And while I allow myself the creative freedom to spend days working on various books, I always come back to the one book I'm working on, right? So like, I might have a story in my head and I want to put it, into the vault, but I know that I'm locking that away because I have to stay focused on one particular book until I can get it out into the world and not get too distracted. And I think having, in this case, I have a really great editor that keeps me on track. She gives me accountability and deadlines and says, this is the book we're working on right now. Go write that story, but then come back because here's what we're working on now. I think that having those people around you are really, really important, and people and systems to just keep you from, there's a sense of guilt that leads to burnout when you don't accomplish everything that you want to accomplish, or when you hop from thing to thing to thing, you can feel a sense of incomplete or lack because you're not really finishing something thoroughly. What I know happened for me when I was trying to really, I didn't have good coping skills around this, or I wasn't really super aware of it at first, was I would spread myself far too thin. I was taking on so much and had no boundaries around kind of saying yes and trying to take it on. And so I couldn't, I wasn't giving any one thing my full depth. So everything was getting a version of me or a version of my capabilities that was less than what I could offer. And so I felt I would constantly be in a state of sort of shame around that, or guilt around like, oh, I'm not doing this to the best of my ability. I'm not diving in with depth in the way that I need to. And I needed to connect that to my own ADHD in order to understand that, hey, you're going to have this tendency. You have to work to overcome it. And you've got to work to put systems in place that sort of force you to stay on track and to not spread yourself so thin. If that is, for me, it was boundaries on how many volunteer things I could do. I do a lot of volunteering. And I had to sort of put boundaries around volunteering. I had to say, I will write for this 1 hour a day in the morning, and then I will go to the gym, and then I will go to work, and I will not work on, my book while I'm at my day job, or I will not work on my publishing house except on the weekends. And so there's just really these kind of boundaries that keep me from burning out by just by staying focused, I guess.
So when you found out that you had ADHD, do you think that that was easier for you to say, "Oh, I guess I don't have to do this all like that"?
I don't know that it was any easier. I think it was legitimizing in the sense of like, I always wondered, like, why isn't everyone else like this? Do other people have more of a capacity to relax? Why do other people, are able to focus better? How does this person, stay so very focused or so very, in line, or go down in such depth into a topic when I can't seem to get myself to do that? How do other people do that? And so understanding that there was an actual reason behind it, and then giving me a foundation of, quite honestly, of research, being able to read other people's work, talk to other people. What are the things that work for them? What are the things that I could take from that? How do I understand my own brain better? How do I understand my own tendencies better? All of that was more legitimizing. I don't know that it made it easier, but it made it, uh, just more validating that like, okay, there's a reason for this. I'm not crazy. It's not a bad thing, but it is different, and different means you have to, think differently and work differently and be open to different solutions than other people need.
So when you started like realizing that, because you talked a lot about different strategies and coping mechanisms. Now, is that something that just came natural to you? You're like, I need to come up with something to help me do this. Or did you like do coaching? That's what I do. So what got you going on those? Have you always used them?
Yeah, I think I developed them over time. And could like better refine them. I think the time blocking thing was probably something that took me the longest to really do intentionally. I didn't truly acknowledge that deficit in my behavior until after the diagnosis. And I was like, yeah, I am actually really bad at time, and I can get a lot done, but I also can be, sort of really haphazard in the way that I get it done. And I could be much more intentional and be much more efficient, especially as I started to take on more and more things. When I started my second company, when I started doing more speaking and more traveling, I had to find a way to make that all work. And part of it too, when I wrote my first book, it was really important to me. It was something I had been sort of churning on for a decade, and always sort of beating myself up about, why am I not making more progress? Why am I not moving this forward? I had friends and colleagues who were writing books much quicker, and I'm like, why? And it was really truly about just getting focused in time and really time blocking that this is when I can write. This is when I can have the mental creativity and passion to do this work. And I've got to make my schedule work around that if I want that to be a number one priority for me. And so that's worked for me. And I think it was really hard for me to kind of admit that I was bad at that because I've always been spinning a lot of plates. But what I wasn't realizing is I was spinning them, but really inefficiently. And so I did not do any formal coaching. Like I said, I did a lot of self-research, I read a lot of, I mean, I'm an academic, so like I read a lot of medical journals, I read a lot of academic journals, I read a lot of books, I listened to a lot of podcasts. I sort of did a lot of deep research and self-analysis through journaling and that kind of thing. And I listened deeply to other women who were sort of late diagnosed and figuring out their coping strategies. So it turns out I've had a lot of these successfully going on for a long time, but there was more to add. And that's where I had to like dig in a little bit.
I know you talked about being in gifted programs when you were a kid with ADHD, and a lot of times it's a misconception that, people with ADHD are less intelligent, and
That's
that
right.
couldn't be farther from the truth.
Right.
So, what do you think what role did your ADHD play in your different programming, or did it?
I mean, I would say that I was really lucky to have an opportunity. I was actually on a work trip last week and I mentioned gifted, and both of the colleagues that I was with who were younger, didn't even know what it was. They didn't even know that gifted existed. And so I feel very lucky that I had the opportunity to be a part of that because I quite honestly was really bored for most of school. Most of K-12 school came really, really naturally easy. And I was pretty bored, and boredom is the worst possible thing for someone with ADHD, right? Because we'll just start disengaging, and I say that broadly, but I would start disengaging from anything that makes me bored. Actually, I had a job earlier in my career that was sort of played out in that exact way, and I really didn't I wasn't emotionally mature enough to really understand it until afterwards, but I just was completely disengaged after about a year and a half because I had kind of mastered everything that they needed from me, and quite honestly, I needed to be promoted or I needed to be given special projects, and I wasn't getting those things. And I don't know that I recognized what I needed enough to articulate them as well as I could now, for example. But I definitely think it was a huge piece of why I eventually kind of left a job that was probably a very good job if I had been able to better articulate what I needed, which was just more challenge. And that happened in school. And so gifted became a very important part of because it actually was hard. And I was with other kids who were inquisitive in different ways than I could be in a regular classroom. And so being able to have that special space was really important. And we got to do more in-depth science projects and deeper reading and literature and things that by comparisons, students in my same grade were not having access to. And that kept me more engaged in school than I would have. And I know that there are kids who, are very, very smart who don't end up making good grades. I was not one of those. I was kind of a people pleaser, say, or an achievement oriented kid. So I definitely made good grades. But I know there are kids who are smart enough to make good grades and just get bored and
Right.
unchallenged, and then they let their grades slide because they just disengage. And I can see that tendency in myself in other ways.
Boredom, I don't know about you, but I find boredom to be almost physically painful.
Yeah.
I really do not like to be bored.
It's very, very challenging, and I think today's day and age, I think it's even harder because our default as a society is to pick up your phone and go onto social media, and that is something that I think can cause a lot of additional stress on folks. It can be, depending on what your algorithm looks like and what you're being fed, it can lead you down rabbit holes of a lot of different things. Anything from sort of the world is crashing to I'm just down a rabbit hole of comparison, especially, teenage girls can get down
Yeah, for
a,
sure.
a whole thing of disconnecting from the realities of self. And I think that is really like social media has given us an outlet for boredom that is not necessarily healthy. And we're much more susceptible to it if we are in this space of ADHD, right? So
Absolutely. It's instant dopamine. And
yeah.
it just, it's really something interesting to note, though, that people with ADHD who put down their phones for a period of time actually function better.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's it's a distraction to everybody, but I know that if I put my phone down and walk away from it and say I'm not going to check it for an hour, I'm going to get a lot more done than if I've got the phone, even knowing that maybe nothing's going to come through. I'm still know that the phone's there, right? And it's still a distraction because I might, what was this? I think I have a question. I think I'll ask the Google.
Yeah. Yep. No, it is. It's funny. We try to have no phone dinners, and it can be very hard because it will inevitably come up, even if you are not disengaging from conversation or whatever, and we don't have our phones out like in that way. Something will come up and it's like, hey, remember when? And we want to look up a picture of something, or we want to look up, when did we do that thing? And you want to look up a date. And it can be so hard because the distraction is, even once you re-engage with your phone, will you stay on just the thing that you're engaging it with, right? Like, will I just look up that one picture, or will I then notice that I have 5 text messages from people and I'll want to go answer those, or I'll see the time and think, oh, I needed to, X, Y, and Z, whatever. And so there's this it's such low-hanging fruit to be distracted by our own technology.
Absolutely. Low-hanging fruit. That's really a good way of putting it because that's what it is. And a lot of times it'll glue us right to our chair if we're not careful. I myself have been known to throw my phone across the floor, to get it away from me. I'm either going to have to get up and go get it, which if I go back and sit down after I get up and go get it, I am not going to feel great about myself.
Yeah, 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 exactly. Exactly.
So you work with leadership a lot and you
Mhm.
work in leadership, right? So
Right.
I know that ADHD can be a great thing for people in leadership and it can be a detriment for people in leadership. I know for me, it was a little bit of both, because
Mhm.
it did allow me to do a lot of things that I think a lot of people weren't able to do. And then on top of that, to be able to think a little bit differently, like outside the box.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I did a podcast a couple of months ago, and it was 2 hosts, and one of them had a lot of curiosity when I mentioned it. Came up in a brief conversation. The podcast was not about ADHD. It just came up as a sentence that I think I said about, having a lot of irons in the fire. And the host was really kind of the one host was very inquisitive and curious about it, and the other was very skeptical and was just immediately sort of like kind of discounting this as if it was some kind of crutch. And I'm very defensive in the sense of saying, like, no, it's my superpower. Like, it's not a bad thing, but it does, just like any superpower, it can be misused. I find the same thing when I'm dealing with leaders. Like, most of my programs that I run are very sort of community focused. And so we don't get into those kind of personal traits as much. But one of my programs is very introspective, and I take leaders on a journey through their personal, leadership, both the challenges and the potential and the kind of legacy they want to lead. And in those conversations, there is a real deep sense of folks who are either curious, or they somehow know, whether or not they're diagnosed or not, they somehow just know that about themselves. And there's a real sense of, how do I harness the power of this while also avoiding the pitfalls? And that's where, I would say it's a very personal journey, but I can certainly offer my tips, and I encourage people to offer their tips and sort of make what I call a treasure chest of potential, or a toolkit full of potential tools, and use the ones that make sense for you. And if you don't want to use a circular saw, don't use one, right? So I think that there are different ways for people. But the first and foremost thing that I want leaders to do is to understand that it's not an excuse to do bad work. It's not an excuse to, you know, not have professionalism, or not, live up to your full potential as a leader. But it is, if you don't have it, it's a point of empathy that you should envelop. If you don't have it and you lead other people with it, you need to develop your leadership on how to lead differently. Like, I have a number of staff people that work for me, and at least one, if not two, have ADHD. One diagnosed, one I believe has it but is undiagnosed. But I lead them differently. I have to give different kinds of direction, and I have to lean into being a good manager in different ways to people who have or have not, you know, these kind of skills. And how do you help yourself become the best leader you can be by understanding other people? And then how can you help yourself become the best leader by understanding yourself?
Absolutely. Well, believe it or not, we have been on here for a while chatting away. It's
Excellent.
great conversation. And I always like to give my guests the last word, but with my question.
All good.
So, my question for you is if you had let's say, a college kid who was considering leadership as a career kind of move,
Mhm,
but they had ADHD pretty bad,
mhm.
what advice would you give them?
I think that the number one thing that all of us need to do is to get really comfortable in stillness. It is probably the most challenging skill for it's really challenging for anyone, quite honestly, in today's day and age, but it's really challenging for those of us with ADHD. And so getting comfortable in stillness, you can calm yourself down if you're overwhelmed. You can think more clearly about what is next. You can grow your emotional intelligence, which helps you handle situations in the workplace better. You can be strategic. I think the number one thing is to get comfortable with stillness. Stillness is very challenging for all humans. It is even more challenging when you have ADHD, and the importance of it cannot be understated. The ability to calm yourself down when you are overwhelmed, to listen to your body when you need to rest, to put the gremlins at bay who might be, telling you that you are not doing enough or just one more chapter, just one more work task, just one more whatever. And also to grow your emotional intelligence in a way that helps you understand the way that ADHD manifests itself for you, and also your empathy for how it might manifest in other people or how your behavior might be received by other people. Growing that empathy allows you to communicate better, allows you to be a better leader, be a better friend, partner, colleague, all the things.
That is beautifully said.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, Melanie, it has been a great conversation. Thank you again so much for coming on the show.
Of course. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
So, for our butterflies on the wall who have been listening in, I hope that you will subscribe and like and do all those things. And with that, we'll see you next time.